Hi everyone, this is John Van. I am the founder of the GGV Publishing Podcast. Today we have our first guest on this podcast, and it is no other than Christian DeLuca, who just released his book, The Little Red Book. And as he says himself, this book is surely not little, but it is red. Christian, welcome to the GGV Podcast, man.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
Awesome. Well, first of all, let me tell you in person, congratulations on releasing this massive book. It is big. It is big. It is 533 pages. And as I said, I really enjoyed working on it. I really enjoyed reading the book. It was fascinating. Uh, why don't you tell the audience what drove you to write about China? I know you explained in the introduction, but I think if you can synthesize a little bit what drove you to Chinese culture, to Eastern Asian culture in general, I believe,
Mhm.
because I assume that you probably also have interest in Korean and maybe Japanese culture. So what drove you to that part of the world?
So it all started when I was 3 years old, and my father introduced me to a little game called Dynasty Warriors. Um, Pretty mindless violence at a tender age of 3, but it was some of my favorite memories was playing that with my father, and eventually it was his PlayStation 2. He gave it to me, and he was like,
Oh.
"All right, have at it." And then I bought the next. I think I had all the games, even
Awesome.
up till now. And then I think it was the first one I played was Dynasty Warriors 3. And I think I only noticed that these people that were represented in the game were actually real people was Dynasty Warriors 5. And that was like when I started using the internet a little more regularly. And I was like reading their Wikipedia pages for hours, and I'm like, wow, this guy's this guy actually only had one eye. That's crazy. It's like, oh, this man died in this battle, so that's why, like, it happens in the game that way. Um, so just being a lifelong fan of that game, just being interested in primarily the Han Dynasty, that was just a hobby
Okay.
generally. Just playing the games. I never really thought much of anything about it, but um, then I got to college and I had a
So, and
class.
and which college did you go to, if you don't mind telling the
I
audience?
went to Rampo College of New Jersey. It's a
Okay,
small college in
got it.
New Jersey, up north. Um, I had a Chinese professor, not language, but Chinese business. Basically, she would explain how business is done in China, um, strategies for entering the market there. And when she started talking about some of these things and the homework assignments that we were given, I was like, wait a second, there's kind of an overlap here. So then, I brought that up to her and she goes, yes, it's definitely there. But not a lot of people like could recall all those years back and be like, hey, this is the reason why we still do this, is because this started 2000 years ago. It's been a tried and true method. We're not going to change it too much. So that, in short, is what inspired me to kind of undertake this journey. Um, so a lot of passion and just having that aha moment is always like a really fun feeling. So
And how how was the writing process? Because again, right, it's important to reiterate this is 533 pages, and this is your first book ever.
yeah,
Well, you went hard, man. You were you went really hard. Like for someone releasing his first book ever, 533 pages is no joke, right? It's but well, so what was the writing process for you? What actually uh triggered you to be like, okay, it's time for me to actually sit down and start writing. Of course, this is not a book that you wrote in a day.
yeah.
It's a lot of research, especially a lot of self-discipline and consistency. doing it. I'm sure there are days you did not feel like writing, but you're like, I'm in the middle of this. I gotta go through it.
Yeah.
So can you share your journey with the audience? Because what I'm telling you is that this is what I went through especially at first, but now it's routine for me. But
Yeah.
what was your experience?
So originally this was I only planned for this to be a research paper. Um, but the problem with that and analyzing culture and making it proving that it has an outcome on certain things today, not really can't really prove that like in a research setting. Um, but for I just kept writing and then eventually I was like I think it was around 13 or 14 word pages. Not like how we formatted it. It was just the default.
Yeah, the default. Yeah.
I was like, okay, this is way too long. I was thinking about like, maybe releasing it like on a platform like Substack or something. Like, nah, might as well just go all the way. Really dig in, just make it how I want to make it. Because I think writing this much is a gift and a curse because sometimes I do wish I could be a little more brief, but you can't really be brief with Chinese history. So
No,
um
but I will also say, so excuse me, it's not to cut you off, but I want to add something to what you just said here. I think you are fundamentally a writer. And when you have that writing syndrome in you, you cannot be brief.
yeah.
I'm telling you this from experience. I wrote more than 2 dozen books.
Hmm.
I'm telling you, we are people who think a lot. And when you have that skill to put on paper what you have in here, you want to put everything you have up here on
Yeah.
paper. It's amazing. And it's it's a curse too because it kind of make you introvert when you read a lot because you're always sitting
Yeah.
and writing and researching. It's a curse in the sense that you socialize less, but that's your guilty pleasure too that you're
Hmm.
experiencing. And now that you release your first book, you will receive the copies very soon. Once you have that and you actually hold the book and read it, you're like, I'm the one who did this. Man, it's it is perhaps the greatest feeling ever. Right? It's one of the best moments you actually experience in life. And it will, in my opinion, I think it will like stimulate you now to even write more.
Yeah.
Maybe the books that you will write later may not be as big as this one, but
Hmm.
it will it will it will encourage you to write more. Or maybe every book you write is as big as this one. Who knows? Right. And but let me ask you this. So um what was your writing process? So you realized that okay, you wrote 14 pages and you were like, okay, this is too long. But what was the rigor did you have like a schedule to like how you're gonna write? Did you go by I'm gonna write perhaps 500 words every day, 1,000 words every day, or I'm gonna write 5 pages a day? Like, what was your process?
Yeah. So for any friends and family watching this, they will absolutely know how into my Google Calendar I am. I very rigorously plan every free moment of the day. um
I'm somewhat the
I
same
even
way.
I even plan free time, which is kind of funny, but
Right.
that's just if I didn't have that, I don't think I'd be able to stay as disciplined as I was with this. Um, but I took at least an hour to an hour and a half every day to write, and there was no real, I think on a monthly basis, there was like a word goal, but there was no word goal or page goal per day. It was just like, all right, I want to write this many words this month. if I do it earlier, cool. Then I could kind of spend a little more time at the end of the month researching. Um, but it worked well for me, I think. But in the same vein, I learned a lot about how I would do things a little differently next time,
Mhm.
which is, definitely valuable. And I'm
And
sure, with as many books as you've written, you've learned something new each time when you're writing. You're like, kind of wasted time with this. Maybe I could put more effort into this and whatnot.
and uh when so every day you were writing and everything, once you were done with the very last chapter, the conclusion, what went through your mind? Like you're like, finally, it's over, or what was the exact emotion and thought that you had at that very moment when you were done drafting the very last page, the very last phrase of the book?
So the funniest thing was while midway through writing it, the um the Chinese Communist Party meets, I think, is it every year, every 2 years or something, all together. And those things are called like the plenary congress. They have like there's been, I don't know, 40 something.
Yeah.
So I knew that something like once we got into the current events part of this book, I needed to put a hard stop on it because otherwise I could keep writing forever because then, things change day by day.
Yeah.
So I said, all right, this Congress will be where I finish because then it was a good point on where I could end it because then I could look to the future and that those meetings tell you a lot about how China's going to um continue to operate
Mhm.
until the next meeting.
Yeah.
So it just seemed right. And when it actually got to that day, I finished and I was like, huh, how about that? I think at the time it was uh before we formatted it, I think it was like 300 something pages. But
Mhm.
again, that's full
The
default.
default, yeah. So like when I remember when you sent it to the company, uh I even wanted to ask you if you look at other publishers before sending your documents to GGV Publishing, or you're like, GGV Publishing is the publisher I want to go with. But before you answer that question, I remember when I received the manuscript, I was like, holy moly, this is a lot. This is a lot, like 700 page, but of course it was like somewhat like double space, and it
Yeah.
was a little, it was more of a draft. So I knew
Hmm.
that if I was able to trim it, it will I could reduce, I could condense it a little bit, like maybe changing like the font and stuff like that. But yeah, now like so when you were done, did you look for many publishers before you select GGV Publishing, or you're like, this is the company I want to go with and no questions asked?
Yeah. So my professor recommended a couple different publishers, but they seemed a little more geared towards academic,
Mhm.
like more academic research. Um, I think that I was looking for a smaller publisher, but one that was passionate about all the authors and the works.
Mhm.
So, and especially just being a follower of you for quite a few years now. And you definitely playing a part in kind of nursing this academic curiosity in
Mhm.
me. Um, that it just made sense in my opinion. So, I saw that. I think I was in the middle of writing it when you started GGB publishing.
Yeah.
So I was like, there we
That's
go.
it.
It's written in the stars.
Yeah, yeah, I remember. Yeah, it was like because my process was that I I hate depending on people
Mhm.
overall, and I was like, okay, and I'm pretty experienced author at this point. I self-published, I also published with a publishing company in France. There was either another publishing company here that accepted my work, but I declined it. I was
Mhm.
like, I don't want it. And I think it's Hamilton Books. And then I was like, why not start my publishing company?
Mhm.
Right? I was like, I built not just a track record, but also a brand. People have read my work, they trust my work, and I'm a very, very rigorous guy. If you write with me, you gotta be ready because I am. I write very fast. That's me. Like I write very fast, but I don't stop until I'm done.
Mhm.
And the way I write is that like I go by chapter. And I'm currently working on a biography of Thomas Sowell, and I'm planning on publishing somewhere toward his birthday, like late June.
Mhm.
Few people don't know about this, but now that I'm mentioning on the podcast, so people will know. But there is a book that I will release in February after, since the Little Red Book is on the market now. So there's a book that I will be publishing because I also miss writing. Like because for the
Yeah.
whole year of 2023, I didn't really write as prioritize my authors. You guys are my clients, so your work comes first. And
Mhm.
it was a little hard because I used to write every day, especially like in book format. And I kind of miss that. But now that the submissions kind of like slow down a little bit, so I can pick up on my personal work.
Yeah.
And but it was I was really proud that I could pretty much assist any author that, especially first time author, because I know that there are a lot of people like you, Christian, who are very talented, good
Mhm.
writers, but you just need the platform, you need the opportunity. And that's what I wanted. Because like the big publishers, it's more of a corporation.
Yeah.
They will even say you need like a literary agent. It's pretty bureaucratic. With me and with GGV Publishing, at least it's more like it's a small publishing company, so it's more laid back. And so I was honestly glad that you submit your work. I read I of course I didn't read the whole thing for the 3 weeks because this is pretty long. But like the way a publisher determines, he reads usually the introduction, maybe the first 2 or 3 chapters, and then the conclusions, and then be like, okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
I'll go for it. And then we also look at the potential sales of the book. Is it something that is going to sell? And this is a historical book, so it's not controversial or anything at all. It's just like explaining uh, the historical, political, economic, and social evolution of China so that you understand today why the Chinese government is making the decisions they're making. It's
Yeah.
important to
Exactly.
understand their philosophy, but we will dive into that in a bit. I want to ask you now, like, what was your favorite chapter personally in this book? Because there are, what, 13 chapters?
Mhm.
What was your favorite, or let me put it this way, what was your favorite dynasty
I
of all?
mean, I have to go back to the Han. That's it's
The
where it
Han?
all started. It's where it all started. I'm all like into the Three Kingdoms
Mhm.
history and everything. It was just such an interesting time. I always tell people if Game of Thrones happened in real life, it was that time period.
So, what was the difference? Now we're going to be a little more technical here. Now we are actually diving into the book. What was the difference between the Zhou dynasty and the Han dynasty? Because you said the Han is your favorite. You said that's where it really started. So, what was the difference between the Han, who pretty much triggered everything, and the Zhou, which were before the Han?
Yeah. So, um, back then there was actually no emperors. It was just kings.
Mm.
Um, so I mentioned the figure King Wen, who eventually would become a pretty people would recall him a lot and look at him as one of the most virtuous leaders in Chinese history. Um, but that's definitely the major difference, and that only changed in the Qin Dynasty, very short. But the Qin Dynasty is actually who started the construction of the Great Wall. So there you go, one of the major wonders of the world created back so way back when. I don't really understand why they went from king to emperor. I mean, can be used interchangeably, but hey,
Yeah, because
emperor,
I was about to ask like what is the difference between a king and an emperor then, right? Is
yeah,
an emperor has more power or
the title invokes more power for sure.
right?
Um, I think, but one of the things that was interesting with the Zhou dynasty was um, how they already China already kind of worked its way through feudalism during that time. Whereas in Europe, feudalism was around until fairly recently, past several hundred years
Yeah.
recently. Um, so I found that interesting that being that China's been around as a civilization way longer than a lot of other societies, they kind of have had that natural progression already. So even by the Zhou dynasty, they were already working on different agricultural methods. There was no like sort of hereditary land ownership. It was just like, hey, if you do your job, you get the land. There you go. And then they had an agricultural system, quite a utopian ideal, but it kind of worked to varying degrees. Basically, everyone had their own private plot
Mhm.
of land, which they would use um, for their own personal agriculture. And then there would be a um, larger plot of land in the middle, which was a communal agriculture, agricultural landscape. And then they would all work in that one too. So you're already kind of seeing these different ideas back in 1500 BC, which is truly interesting. How they got there and why they found that first, I don't really know, but it's definitely fascinating to see those differences. And then, you know, then the technology gets better and the Han builds upon these concepts. They get rid of the stuff that didn't really work. So like that, the agricultural system I was just talking about,
Mhm.
they bagged that. Um, and based on the different times, you did see you did see them go back to certain things of the Zhou though as well. So while the emperor was the supreme authority over the nation, you cannot, especially back then, you cannot rule the entire nation of China with an iron fist by yourself. There's just no way your army could stretch that far. So then in the Han Dynasty specifically, which is what led to the unrest, was the emperor gave more responsibility and titles upon warlords.
So he delegate
Yeah.
power, so sort of. Okay.
So then this person would be the governor of such and such province.
Now let me ask you this. This is getting very interesting. So yes, he did delegate, but was it more like the uh indirect rule or the direct rule? Let me explain what I mean. During colonization, European colonization, you have like the direct rule, that was the French. They applied strict policy from Paris to the subject in the colonies. And the indirect rule were the British. I love the British method. They pretty much not just delegate, but they say the subject there can govern themselves,
Mhm.
right? So long as they're still subject to our laws, but they can decide to implement those laws the way they want. So was it the same at that time with the emperor when he delegated that power in order to retain control over those territories, or did they apply sort of like the French method?
I think it definitely depends based on the time period, but in the time of the Han, well, actually, let's tackle the Zhou first. The Zhou um probably had a little bit more of that hands off indirect rule, but then it was interesting because if one warlord rose above the rest, that person would be declared the hegemon, and then they would be tasked as like the sole protector of China. And then they had more responsibility and power. But then you go to the Han, you're kind of now seeing a little bit more of what resembles the provincial government setup of China today. It's been developed pretty much for what it needs to be. And there was definitely overarching rules and laws that needed to be followed and upheld by the different governors, but they were able to kind of mold their province's economy to the way that would best fit the province.
Got it. Before we, there are two questions I want to ask you. The first is to talk a little bit about the cultural dimension theory, which is you start the whole book with that. I think that pretty much uh, determines the cultural roots of China, like the mentality, why Chinese people behave the way they do. So I want you to talk about that. And then after that, I want you to talk about the transition from, and it's crucial, from the Qin Dynasty to the Red Dynasty. Because the Red Dynasty, you wrote literally four chapters, on them. So I want you to talk about the Red Dynasty, but first, let's go with the cultural dimension theory so
Yeah.
that people can understand.
So the cultural dimensional theory was something that I learned in a management class. Basically, it's kind of taught in every management like 101 course, because it's all about dealing with people, dealing with employees, dealing with managers and whatnot. So the cultural dimensional theory was created by Geert Hofstede. I believe he's Dutch, and he made different dimensions for how to view culture. Definitely not something to go by in terms of a hard fact, but it does help at least gain a basis on different cultures. You could look at this and be like, ah, okay, I see it. But again, it's not meant to be taken too much as a fact or too literally, because that's like kind of the primary criticism of this theory. But again, this book was meant to be an introduction to Chinese culture, and by putting it in numbers and graphs, it makes it a little easier for people to understand. So
Yeah, no, and I think it's good that you actually put numbers and graph because uh it just doesn't show the seriousness because it's an academic work you actually produce. So I always I don't require, but for anyone who engage into scholarly research, having charts and graphs, it's important because it gives pretty much some sort of like a roadmap to the reader, so and then the reader can verify the data on his own rather than just like mentioning about it.
yeah,
So and would you say that the cultural dimension theory is still applied today? Is it like very vivid in Chinese culture today, or do you think it kind of died off?
I I think it still could be used. It could still be used, especially very helpful if you want to go there and do business there. There's certain types of things that, I mean, that's if there's any place that you should be intimidated to going to do business, it's there. There's a lot of unspoken rules and regulations with just social stuff.
Actually, before we move on to the second part, we're going to move the second part of this in a second, where you talk about the transition from the Qin Dynasty to the Red Dynasty. Why don't you talk a little bit in, like, let's say in 2-3 minutes, why don't you talk about those unspoken rules of Chinese culture when you want to do business there? I'm
Yeah.
curious.
So, the major thing is guanxi. Guanxi, listen, there are like courses about guanxi. It's very, very intense. And despite watching all these videos, reading about it, I don't even know what it is. It's crazy. It's it's something, but it's weird because even like my Chinese professor, she's like, listen, it's like this. It kind of vaguely resembles like gift giving and mentioning people like in a room when they're where they're not there in a positive light. But nobody really knows. But it's held in such high regard, but yet it's not really explainable. Maybe it could be like a language barrier, based on like the Mandarin could maybe explain it a little bit better. But basically it's just a social network of sorts, um, where you establish your clients, establish a relationship with them, but not get too buddy. Like there's a line. I had another professor, he was from Lebanon, I believe. And I remember he said he went to Saudi Arabia to do business. And he did not talk about business until 2 hours before his plane ride home. It was all having fun, enjoying each other's company, building up that relationship. In China, it's a little bit different. There is that. There is establishing that relationship, having fun with, the person you want to do business with. But then there's also that, don't waste my time. Like we're here for a reason. Let's get to
Go
it.
straight to the point. Got
Yeah.
it.
Be honest, but not too honest. So that's why it's a confusing concept to explain, because if there was like a rule, it would be easy to do business in China. But you see a lot of different companies, Western companies, going there and failing because they just don't understand. They don't understand that.
This is very interesting, especially that China is yes, it's a market economy, but also dominated by political dictatorship. So with a communistic mindset. So it's interesting to see how the two reconcile. But we will talk about that in the second part of this podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned. And we are back for the second part of this interview with Christian DeLuca. Christian, welcome back. We are now going to talk about the transition from the Qin Dynasty to the Red Dynasty. What happened and how, and okay, let me put it this way. What were the motivations, right? Because in the book, for example, when we look at the table of contents, you talk about the Qin Dynasty, then you talk about the Republic of China, and then you move now to the People's Republic of China. So can you enlighten us on that transition, on those three guys there? How did we move from Qin to the red guys?
You got it. So the Qing Dynasty, little known fact, the last dynasty in Chinese history was not even Chinese. The Qing was ruled by the Manchus, which is from what is now the region of Manchuria.
Mm.
Um, at the time, they were considered very different because they were more nomadic when the Qing took over the Ming. They were more nomadic tribe. They did not utilize any firearms. They tried and true bow and arrow, spear, swords, all that, which really makes their conquest of the nation pretty impressive. But it's always just interesting to see that the Han Chinese ethnicity was again subjected to foreign rule. The other time that it happened was in the Yuan dynasty, was when the Mongols conquered. So, but an interesting thing about the Qing that I do want to kind of talk about is how they Sinicize their government. The Mongols did it as well, because the key to governing over China is to you adapting to the Chinese culture, not the other way around. Because the Chinese will never adapt to your culture. That's not how that's going to happen. This is like we mentioned before in the first part. This is a civilization that's been fairly genetically the same for thousands of years. They can't just easily change. So, when the Qing Sinicized, it just increases their success in ruling. So their first, obviously every dynasty starts out great. One of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, the Kanshi Emperor, was an early emperor in the Qing Dynasty. And they brought about economic change. The peasants were happy with the rule. Unfortunately, they had to get rather crude haircuts because that was one of their tough rules. But as with any dynasty, and we're now going to bring up the concept of the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is a very central thing in Chinese history too, because each dynasty follows a very set path. Takes over, establishes good rule, people flourish, some corrupt rulers get into power, natural disasters, rebellion, death. So
Wow.
every dynasty follows that mold. I mean, you could just say that's the natural way of ruling. You can't rule forever. Civilizations only last, or governments only last a certain amount of time on average. And in the 1800s, the British introduced a substance to China that ended up turning the nation on its head, and that was opium. So the Qing Dynasty was like, all right, this is kind of getting out of hand here. All of my subjects are high all the time. They're making like nothing's going right. The economy's slowing down. Like, this has got to stop. So they banned the ban that restricted the selling of opium and tried to do their best to close down the ports for the British. And the British and the Dutch East Indian Company were like, nope, we want to make money. This needs you need to get out of our way. And then the first Opium War happens. China loses, and Britain gets what they want. Continues to go poorly. Then there is a absolutely wild religious revolt, or that's to be determined, but there's basically a guy, he had a vision that Jesus was his brother, and he became a rebellion leader, and that was the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and they were pretty potent in terms of their ability to fight. So much so that the Qing had to ask the foreigners to help them. So just think about this. First, they bring poison to your country, poisoning your citizens. Then they beat you. Then they make a horrible treaty where you're just not getting anything.
Yeah.
And then now you have to run to them for help because this government is so fragile that it cannot even defend against a peasant revolution.
Wow.
And the Taiping, which is what very interesting, the Taiping rebels are actually venerated by the Chinese Communist Party today, despite being religious fanatics. They established communal land ownership. In terms of women's rights, women were allowed to have similar government positions as men did and were able to serve in armies. There was the practice of foot binding was banned because foot binding was kind of a thing that represents the lower and the higher class in China, because women with bound feet were considered to be more beautiful than women with not bound feet.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
So then that happens. When the Taiping is finally put down, Qing is like, maybe we should try to like kick the British out again. Second Opium War starts. They lose even worse.
Oh, wow.
Then it's just constantly getting shafted by the foreign powers. There was sort of a lull in action between like the 1860s to the 1900s. But for the most part, China was doing horribly. The people were doing horribly. They were poor. The government was almost a government in name only. And then that led to something called the Boxer Rebellion. Again, some slightly religious fanatics start this rebellion, and they are beating the Qing as well. So the Qing is not having a good track record here because they have been getting their butts kicked by two different peasant revolutions. Now the Boxers were fighting against imperialism. And considering that the Qing were foreigners, they were sort of imperialists to them too. But then halfway through fighting, they were like, wait, the Qing, life was better when the Qing was strong. So maybe we could go back to that. And they offered their services to the Qing. And the Empress Dowager at the time was like, yes, we take this deal, because the peasants were kicking their butt. Surely that this is what they needed to beat the foreign powers. Nope. They were defeated once more. And then it just completely nosedived. And this time period is called the Century of Humiliation. It's something that Chinese people are very well aware of. It was 100 years of repeatedly getting beaten down, kicked, spat on, etc.
Would you say that Chinese culture overall is not like a violent culture?
Say again?
Would you say Chinese culture overall is not a violent culture? Like Chinese people are not violent.
Well, there's been a lot of civil wars in Chinese history, but they don't really tend to expand too much. Sure, they had their tributary states in Korea, and to some degree, they've challenged Japan, mainly because of Korea. But when it came to Korea, it was a tributary state. They didn't absorb it. They let them be. Just pay us money. See ya.
Because like when you look at Japanese culture, for example, Japanese, they have like war is within them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Japanese, they don't hesitate to use violence if necessary to make you compel to the will. And I feel like with China has never been really the case. Although China today is the second largest economy in the world, we have the second largest military. No, I think it's the largest military in the world in terms of people, not in terms
Yeah.
of weapons, but in terms of people. They can literally crush anyone except the US. But China threatens a lot, but doesn't execute their threats, right? They don't carry on their threats. And for anyone who read Machiavelli, it'd say if you threaten someone, you better carry that threat out, right? You
Mm-hmm.
better execute that threat. Otherwise, that person won't take you seriously. And I think that China has always got away with it. They threaten a lot because it's true, and it's true. And the reason why people take the threat seriously is because they have the resources to execute those threats.
Right.
But they don't carry on. Like they I feel like my my understanding is that the way China does is that they use threats as defensive weapons rather than offensive weapons. They're like they're like nuclear weapons. You know, nuclear weapons exist so that no one will start a war,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're sitting, no one is launching. They're just there so that we have peace, peace through strength. I feel like this is the same mentality of the same approach that China is kind of doing, right? Like, yes, we'll blow you up if you piss us off, but we won't we won't do it. Although we have the resources to do it, we won't do it. And so far they never carried the threats through. So which I find interesting. But I am now interested in the Red Dynasty. How did the Red Dynasty, for people who wonder what the Red Dynasty is the Chinese Communist Party. How how they came about?
Sure. So there is one central figure that is really important to the Communist Party that is not from the Communist Party, and that's Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen founded the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist government that started the Republic of China.
Taiwan, right?
Yes, currently now, yeah. So how on earth could the sworn enemy of the Communist Party, the Kuomintang, how could their founder also be venerated by the Chinese Communist Party? Well, that's why you have to go to a book that I read while researching for this book. The Three Principles of the People. It was the principle of nationalism, the principle of democracy, and the principle of livelihood. Both the Kuomintang and the CCP had agreed that nationalism was the way forward because, you see a lot of nationalist movements rise from foreign influence and colonialism because after being exploited by these foreign powers, the natural response is to no, we want a country for our people and we will make it. So then that was Sun Yat-sen went into that. So the two parties agreed about that. Then there was the principle of democracy. Sun Yat-sen actually lived in the Kingdom of Hawaii, and I believe spent some time in the United States where he was subjected to American democracy. And he believed that that was to be the way forward for China. There wasn't so much of a how to implement it, but more espousing the ideas and getting people comfortable with the idea of democracy, because this is a civilization that had an emperor, a central figurehead for thousands of years. It's not something that you could just cold turkey. All right, we're going to govern ourselves. That that idea was totally foreign to the Chinese people, which is why Sun Yat-sen had to kind of bring them up to it. And then there was the principle of livelihood, social programs, uh, healthcare, etc., all that. So now the Kuomintang, the party that Sun Yat-sen created, we're not really too crazy about the livelihood idea. So that's where the break between there was the left wing of the Kuomintang and then there was the right wing of the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen unfortunately died untimely due to illness. And then his successor was Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek hated communists, did not want to work with them, did not want anything to do with them. Whereas Sun Yat-sen was more partial to the idea of working with them. And some people in the Chinese Communist Party even call him a proto-communist himself. I don't really like to say like what his ideology was because only he would have known. But if you want to know what his ideology is, just read The Three Principles of the People. It's a collection of all his speeches over the years. Pretty good read. So then the Chinese Communist Party was created in the 1920s, early 1920s. And it was created because the Kuomintang was not governing effectively or to what these groups of people wanted. So then when it came time to but here's the problem. The Kuomintang did not have free elections because they were the only party. So the CCP was mostly just like a club of sorts where they had different chapters around the country. It was actually very popular in coastal cities. And they spent a lot of their early years kind of establishing contact with the Soviet Union to just establish that rapport with I don't think it was the Bolsheviks at that time, but that was their closest communist neighbor.
If it's after 1917, it was definitely the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the Bolsheviks there, that's when they took power in Russia. So
yeah. So then that's what happened there. And then obviously the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek did not like this. They started repressing and criminalizing membership of the Communist Party. So then there was a certain number of years where they went underground. But then right in the 1930s, they rose up again. Membership grew because it's kind of like that. It's like, oh, the people are banning, like the government's banning this. Maybe they're right. You know, it's kind of that sort of sentiment. And, you know, the ideals of communism are attractive to the peasant class of China at this time because, yeah, the Republic of China, the Kuomintang, it was okay. It wasn't great. It could be better. So they thought the better would come with the CCP. Then the Japanese decide to attack, which leads us to the Sino-Japanese War. Amidst this, right before this, there was the Chinese Civil War, the first part, where the CCP was fighting against the Kuomintang in kind of guerrilla, sporadic warfare. And then the Sino-Japanese War started, and Chiang Kai-shek was so focused on the Civil War, he did not care about the Japanese invading his country. Oh, wow. That's how much he hated communists. So, one of his one of his men, I think he was a lieutenant or something, actually kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek and imprisoned him. It was like, listen, man,
Oh,
our
wow.
country is getting invaded by a foreign power. Do you realize what happened in the past 100 or so years? We were repeatedly exploited by foreign powers. We need to work together and stand up for ourselves. So then that from that was born the United Front.
Mhm.
The communists and the Kuomintang joined together to fight against the Japanese.
Mhm.
So World War II for them kind of started a couple years earlier than it did for the rest of the world.
Okay.
So they were in the war probably for the longest amount of time.
And
Um,
this is one aspect that people don't really mention about. That's interesting.
yeah.
Um, I want you to talk a little bit about the evolution of uh of the Communist Party from Mao. I want you to talk about Mao a little bit. I think that
Mhm.
was my favorite part of the book, the portrait of Mao that you described. And I think you did a great job at being quite impartial. I mean, you cannot be entirely impartial. You have, of course, your appreciation of you have your opinion of the man, but you've tried to be as impartial as you could, and I think you did a great job at that. So why don't you share your assessment of Mao's psychology and who he was as a leader? Yes, we all know he was a ruthless man and he did not hide his ruthlessness. But why was he a ruthless man? What drove him? Because we all have incentive, right? Charlie Munger said, show me the incentive, I showed you, tell me the incentive, I showed the outcome. So when people act the way they do, there's an incentive behind it. And I want you to after describing Mao, I want you to also talk about pretty much the evolution of the Communist Party, like how has it evolved from Mao to Xi Jinping?
Yes. So Mao is one of the big three leaders in Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. They're normally mentioned in the same conversation, more so Hitler and Stalin, because Mao's kind of forgotten about being that Chinese history and everything's not as really at the forefront of our imagination. So, but there's definitely parallels. All three had a kind of a parental issue. They had just not a good relationship with their mother or father, or whomever. And, you know, development for a child is probably the most important part of their life. The first couple years of life are the most important because that's how they learn nature versus nurture, that type of thing. Um, and Mao was not given a very good hand um, with his father being the oppressor. So we see a guy that was also kind of a pudgy young lad too. So that was added to his insecurities. Um, and then there's always these weird things, and it was when I read about how he interacted with his father at one point where he defied him, it was almost like very sad to read because it's like this man's taking so much pride in standing up to his father and defying him. But why? It's like at the end of the day, he played a major part in you being born. Whether he's a good or a bad man is,
He's still your dad.
yeah, exactly. So like why are you taking so much pleasure in making him look small? Like yes, he made you look small. He made you feel small. But why? Like I don't know. For me personally, I guess that's just the blessing of having good parents. I could never
Yeah.
imagine like, doing that to my father. But I'm sure certain people might um empathize with Mao here. Um, so then we see that with that insecurity, Mao enjoys making other people feel small. And we don't see this now, but we'll see this later when he becomes the sole governorship of China. But when that does happen, and after the Kuomintang is weakened after World War II, the communists prevail, and the people have risen up, is what was Mao's speech when the People's Republic of China was founded. We see now that this man is very excited to bring about all these different ideas now because he's been talking about it. These Chinese Communist Party chapter meetings, at like regional chapter meetings, they talked about how they were going to bring the power to the people. Well, now they actually can. And the first few years of the People's Republic of China were probably the closest you will get to seeing on a large scale communism working.
Okay.
Because the people, there were these things set up in villages. They were like cafeterias, not cafeterias, but like just a place where the whole community could gather and eat. State provided food, nothing to worry about. That was really good for a lot of the people. The persecution of landowners was, while violent, was effective in removing that level of inequality in
So they
China.
basically destroyed the Chinese yeoman farmer. That's you see the thing with communism, wherever it is tried and whatever cultural characteristic they add to it, it works at first. It
Mhm.
always does. I always say communism or socialism, it's like a Chinese product. You buy it, it's poor quality, but you buy it for the first 2 months. The product is about at the at the common, I mean, at the cultural level, the political level, for the first few years it works, and then it becomes defective. The same way you buy fake Chinese product, it works for the first 2 months and then becomes effective. That's why no one was able to actually defend communism to its full extent. Oh, absolutely. Even Thomas Sankara, I don't know if you know him, but he's like an African revolutionary leader. He's perhaps the only communist that I respect because of his he really wanted to do good for his people. But I always
Yeah.
say, no matter how good the intention was, communism was about to fail in Burkina Faso anyways, because we know communism doesn't work. There's the absence of prices. People need property rights to create growth. If you take people's property away, there's no incentive, so there's no need to produce. And that was the same thing that happened whether it's in China, in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, the case is a little different because they prioritize militarism over economic growth, which was stupid in my opinion. But it's interesting. One thing I find fascinating is the transition from Mao to Deng Xiaoping.
Mhm.
Deng Xiaoping took pretty much he pretty much like changed Chinese political economy by incorporating market features into Chinese communism. And what is interesting is that they all say it is temporary. Even Lenin did the same with the new economic policy. Because communism was destroying Soviet Russia. But Deng Xiaoping did the same here. But it worked with Deng Xiaoping. All the data show how prosperity came back to China, and in within a decade, China became one of the top 15 to top 10 most powerful countries. Now you can't, like, China is a political dictatorship And economically, it's liberal. Because if people have the right to own property, it's liberalism, period. That, you know. Um, but where do you see the future of China under the leadership of Xi Jinping? I mean, before we go, because we gotta go soon, but I
Mhm.
want to have your opinion on Xi Jinping is here. He changed the constitution. He's here to stay. Where do you see China heading under his leadership?
So the most important thing to just mention before we go to Xi Jinping is Deng's concoctment of the ideology socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is going back to the Hofstede cultural dimensional theory now, where China scored low on uncertainty avoidance, which means that truth is flexible and relative.
Mhm.
So they're very pragmatic. This means that they're okay.
Mhm.
They're okay with manipulating the definition of socialism and communism to fit their culture, to fit the culture's needs. So I think because of that, they were able to transition very well
That's
from from the communism to more of a market economy. Whereas in the Soviet Union, they waited until the very last minute, which, then it was just unfettered capitalism where you saw oligarchs spawning like right when the Soviet Union fell. That's not good because no one benefits from that. And in China, they were able to nurse it a little more slowly and slowly introduce more of these things. At first, it was only certain little zones that were able to be more liberal in terms of the market, but then more regions were given that. So now Xi Jinping has, I think that is probably the term that comes most out of his mouth, is socialism with Chinese characteristics. He always mentions it, which is a nod to him wanting to continue Deng's legacy. But then there's also some people that say, well, the way he governs is a little bit more like Mao. But people don't realize that Deng Xiaoping was actually pretty authoritative as well. It's just that, he was a small, nice looking guy.
That's what
So,
I said. It's true. He
so
looks he looks like a nice guy, so you wouldn't expect him to, to use violence.
in my book, you'll see some of the more underhanded things he did to maintain legitimacy and power over the entire nation. Um, but she's interesting. I view him favorably in terms of effectiveness as a national leader. I think he's very effective. Um, Certainly, yes, changing the constitution to kind of set himself up for a until he retires, basically,
Until he
which also
dies, pretty much.
which also is a historical kind of phenomenon because there used to be a thing with emperors where the father would abdicate for the son, but he was still pulling the strings.
Yeah.
So when Deng Xiaoping retired, he was still part of the elder apparatus, which ran the country. They were it was a bunch of like we complain, Americans complain about Biden being so old in office. These were 90-year-old Chinese men ruling the country. So you really see that. It's crazy. But I think probably one of the things that viewers would want me to touch on, will Xi Jinping make the call and invade Taiwan? No, I do not think so. I think that he values the economic standing of China currently, and that is a surefire way to launch yourself back into not a good place because I think that if that were to occur, it's just it doesn't make sense because they have everything to lose with that war. Just for like a national pride or legitimacy, cultural legitimacy. Whereas like Russia invading Ukraine, Russia was kind of already in the dumps already. They
Mhm.
didn't really have too much to lose economically. So it just wouldn't make sense, in my opinion. And I view the standing committee in the CCP pretty favorably in terms of their overall governance and rationality. So I think that all nine of them will not make that major call. So I think that China will continue using soft power and expanding the Belt and Road Initiative to other countries and influencing their um, standing in the world, diplomatic standing in the world, uh, through the use of trade and business. I think
Awesome.
that's kind of where that's going.
Awesome. Well, Christian, thank you very much for this interview. It was amazing learning about you, about your writing process, about the motivations that drove you to write that book, and to learn about the book itself, to learn about Chinese culture, to learn about the evolution of the political, economic, and social dimension of China. And where can people find you?
Yeah, you could follow me on Instagram, Christian Deluxe, DeLucs, LinkedIn under my name, and that's pretty much all I use. So,
Awesome. I mean, you're very focused, and that's what matters. Well, Christian, thank you very much. Again, we are very, very proud to have you. You're actually our first very guest on the podcast, so thank you for that. Thanks for
it is an
publishing
honor.
with GGV Publishing. I will link the book in the description of this podcast, and so that people can purchase the book on Amazon or directly on GGV Publishing if they want to.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you have if you plan on a signing event, but if you do, let the company know, and we will supply you.
Awesome. Thank you
Awesome.
for the opportunity.
No problem. Well, thank you very much, Christian, and we will see you guys next time.